right, yes, so today I'm playing the role of Ken Lane now. I'm going to hand that to you, David. And we're going to talk about a really big topic, this Internet of Things. And I'm excited to see here what our panel has to say about it. And I thought we could start by, if you could each give kind of a brief intro to who you are, what you do, and how the heck that relates to this giant topic that we're going to talk about today. Okay. Go ahead, go for it.
My name is David Henricson Briggs. I work for a company, or help found a company, called Playback Energy. We work with energy companies and developers and consumers, and we are a bridge between those two. Energy companies gather a lot more data than they can do anything with, and consumers don't ever get to see that data. So that's what we do. And I guess the Internet of Things relates directly to energy companies because they all love it. They all see it as their future, the way they'll save money and be able to sell new services.
Hi, my name is Sundh, and I have my own company called Coda Collective. And I work with Internet of Things and also work with APIs and embedded systems, mainly with actually marketing and installations. So I think this theme is really interesting, and there's a huge need for it for developers like me and others.
Thank you. Hey, I'm Bradford Stevens. I run developer evangelism at Ping Identity. And before that, I was the CEO of a VC-backed database startup called Drawn to Scale. We are really interested in Internet of Things because when there's billions and billions of connected devices out there, somebody's got to manage the identity of all that, and it'd be a good fit for us.
Hi, I'm Ronnie. I'm an API architect with Layer 7. I'm a frequent user of the internet, so I think that qualifies me. We do a lot of work around APIs. So we provide API gateways and portals. I help design them. I think there's a real overlap here. I think in some ways I'm going to represent the everyman on this panel. I think the other guys on here know a lot more about the IoT space than I do. But let's see how it goes.
So where then does it, if it's everything, if all the things, we're going to internet all the things, right? So is there any boundary to this?
Yeah, it's a good question. I hope not, right? I hope that the real idea here is that everything can start to become part of a bigger network. I think there's challenges to that. When you talk to IoT folk, they talk about actuators and sensors, right? Collecting data, doing things with data. Maybe we move to the point where with wireless power systems, everything is almost a mini computer, right? And everything you interact with in the physical world has a digital interaction that takes place too, and it's all magic, right? That would be what I would hope for. Shall I pass it down? Is that how we do it?
Pass it to Ellen. Ellen, I'm curious, sort of. So if it is all of this, you're seeing these practical applications.
Yeah.
Now, right? What's the low-hanging fruit in Internet of Things? What are the areas that you're already seeing have huge impact?
I think there are actually two different perspectives. One is, or several, but one is the perspective of the maker scene, people actually buying circuit boards that we want to connect to the internet. And the other scene is the industrial scene with big companies that actually already does this. The only difference is that it's not opened. So for instance, Volvo has their own internal Wi-Fi in their cars, and Saab and other companies. And they have some of these as endpoints to their APIs for their apps. So you can open a car from an app, and you can even start it from an app, but they don't guarantee that it's confirmed that you open or close it. So it's kind of those kind of issues. But I think the main thing is to actually open those APIs. And talking with you, David, about energy, there are big energy companies that actually have these APIs internally. But what if we want to tap into them and actually connect them into our social layer? For instance, adapt our energy consumption to our calendar or something like that. So I think there are like many big things to actually look at here. And for coming from the makerspace, I think the main thing is a standard for APIs. It's a standard for all circuit boards that can actually talk Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and other frequencies, radio frequencies. Yeah.
And so you mentioned energy there, and David, one of the interesting things you said in your intro is that energy companies are behind it. Now, that's really interesting to me because Ellen was mentioning that there are these spots that are ready for it, yet they're closed. So how does that work in energy where they're excited about it? I would think this would be more user driven. The users want, sort of like I was talking about with asking for APIs. These are energy companies that are asking for it. So how does that
I think you can differentiate between energy companies seeing it as the way of the future, and as I said, the way that they can make money. But also they then look at their own systems that they have today, and it doesn't really, they don't connect, they don't gel. And then they say, well, in 5 years' time, this problem will be solved. We'll have solved this problem by then. But from what I understand, and I'm quite fresh to the energy industry, but from what I understand, it's the last 20 years, the same discussions have been going on. The smart grid is coming, the home of the future is coming, and I think it's been coming since the 1950s. When you're running a big company that, in our space, collects a lot of data, making that data open, giving access to someone else is a huge step that no one wants to commit to, really. I guess our company tries to convince people to commit to that decision, but no one wants to be the person responsible for opening up all of the data that they've been collecting for the last 5-6 years.
And why do you think they're reluctant to?
Because it's scary. It's a boring reason, but I think it's tough to make that decision, to say everything that we've been collecting we can now make available to other people, and they will be able to come up with these things that we've been wanting. The idea has been we'll be able to deliver the things that they've been wanting for so long, but it's not happening. And you need people in the space, and you need people like hopefully us in this room to convince people that they need to open up this data, and that will actually be the Internet of Things. It's not a decision from the CEO of the company or the CIO.
Yeah. So Bradford and I chatted a little bit about something similar, the sort of it's always coming. How do you see where we are now or do you see it as that we're here now, and so now it's the opportunity is there?
Yeah, I actually think you raised a really good point in that a lot of the core value of Internet of Things is in the data and in sort of the network effect, and the sum is greater than the individual parts. And so it seems like the data is there and it's being collected, and yet there is both a lack in larger enterprises of willpower and of technical understanding on how to make this data available. Even some really large enterprises that I've worked with, their state-of-the-art for sharing data is dumping CSV files into a network drive, followed by a lot of prayer. And so I think the joke I made to you is that Internet of Things is kind of like nuclear fusion power, and that nuclear fusion has been 20 years away for the past 60 years, and Internet of Things has been 5 years away for the past 15 years. So until the people, if we're talking about enterprise adoption of Internet Things, until they wrap their heads around API management, authorization, access management, and actually making data consumable, and in what format, like period, they're going to really lag behind startups who are aggressively building, their entire business model around monetizing data access, APIs, and things like that. They'll get there sooner or later. They'll be dragged there. but I don't think we're going to be seeing Orange Telecom establishing a partnership program to give its telemetry data to people anytime soon. It's going to come from tiny little individual device makers, apps, I think mostly centered around using your mobile phone as sort of a hub.
Okay. So, Ellen, sounds like you might have something there.
Again, I think it's interesting that there are some big companies that have both the appliances and the capability of doing this. Like, for instance, Samsung with their smart TVs and their appliances like dishwashers and washing machines, and they are already connected. But the big challenge for them is to actually be able to maintain and to support the old products. That's like one of the things that hold them back. And I think it's interesting to see and look at it as something that if we would cut the Internet of Things API in stone, we could actually manage that, but we want to use new protocols and we want to use new technology for this. Looking at the space industry, which I think is really interesting, when they send out an instrument in space that's going to travel 15 years, they use computers that are 15 years old in order to know that it works. And in some way, I think it's interesting that kind of building in something that's set in stone, because then all your appliances can actually work for a long time. But that's a huge challenge. And also Henricson is interesting because like more than 10 years ago, they did an initiative with smart homes where you actually open your door from your smartphone. And I worked on that project, and I'm still like, where is my jetpack and my shopper? This is like 10 years ago. And their solution was actually an iPad-like interface in a screen fridge. And now we have the iPad. But I do think that Internet of Things is kind of here at the moment. If we look at like startups, but also Kickstarter projects that can have a large impact just by selling one little device that you can control, I think that's where we are going to kind of look forward to Internet of Things. Yeah.
I want to say something. Yeah, I think you're totally right. And there's sort of two perspectives on what the topology of Internet things sort of emerges to be. On one perspective, we see some people see the Internet of Things being a bunch of devices, each of which sort of communicate with each other, reach consensus on decisions, and sort of have almost an emerging intelligence. And I think that's sort of the ultimate vision, but it's also really, really far away. And what we're seeing instead is kind of exactly what you say. I have a dishwasher, a fridge, my front door, whatever. They all communicate to a central device, usually like a SaaS platform or my mobile device. And then that centralized platform allows us to analyze the data, make decisions, and so on. So it's not really a smart Internet of Things, I think, coming for the next few years. It's a bunch of devices that talk to a central something, which makes decisions and lets us experience them.
All right, let's hear from the Everyman. And I mean, it sounds like there's this big possibility, and if we're able to get from here to where Ellen and Bradford are talking about, what's the core value for users, for the Everyman, that Internet of Things?
You know, I talked earlier about user experience. I think there's a great user experience opportunity here, right? I thought it was interesting how you said devices that talk to central servers aren't smart. I think from a user perspective, it doesn't matter how it's happening. If I'm interacting with objects and something amazing happens because of that, that's a wonderful experience. What's happening under the covers doesn't matter. So there's a massive opportunity here. There's also, I think, a little bit of a disruptive idea from a market perspective. If we enter into a world where data is being collected so much, right? If the smart devices aren't the tweet from my fridge, but the every time I ring a doorbell, it sends a signal somewhere that this happened. That's a lot of data. I think traditionally, we've created markets where people trade privacy, their personal information, for services and function. There might be an opportunity here to trade all of the information about everything you do for something, right? So maybe we end up in a world where as long as you use connected devices, you're able to consume services for less than cost because you're trading information about yourself for those services, right? To me, I find that interesting, kind of flips the model on its head a bit.
So that's one potential form of monetization. Yeah, Bradford.
Yeah, so real quick, I mean, we kind of all agree that the technology is here and it's pretty cheap, but it hasn't happened yet because as cool as it is that when I drive up to my house and the lights come on, that's not really life-changing for me. I mean, granted, I live in San Francisco, so, I have every tech gadget attached to my house possible. But I think we haven't seen this happen yet because there's no, to resurrect the 90s phrase, killer app for, the consumer. Turning on my dishwasher is cool. So that's cool. Is that a Fitbit? Yeah. So again, Fitbit is cool. And maybe it's changing some people's lives, but it's not like you're issued a Fitbit at birth. We're not there yet. And I think what's going to be really interesting is when this is going to just emerge, and there's going to be something that none of us here have ever thought of. That's just going to emerge from all the data that we collect or some critical mass. And when that happens, this Internet of Things will be indispensable. But for right now, it just feels like we're waiting for this almost singularity of information to happen.
So I think Fitbit is a good example, though, because people are able to kind of grasp at that. It's right, and it's sort of navel gazing, in that you're seeing your own data, right? Normally, I would be wearing mine, but the battery died, and that's a completely other issue. But so starting with your own self, I mean, the quantified self, is that a place? This question to anyone on the panel: is that a place where Internet of Things could kind of reach that potential for the killer app? Maybe take that first step toward the killer app? Or is it doing that now?
I think with quantified self, it's interesting because it's Internet of Things, and we kind of collect our data somewhere. And I think the killer app will be the one that actually connect all these different behaviors of yourself. For instance, I think Google does it in a way because you're so connected to all their devices. So if you would be connected through your fuel band or through your heart rate or your location in combination, that could be the killer app. But then they all have to speak the same language. And if someone can do that, I think that would really be a push towards it.
Right.
Can I pick up on something you said? You talked about speaking the same language. Now, if we just talk pure API, I think there's a better opportunity as long as they all interoperate. Right, so they don't have to speak the same language. We don't have to follow the same standard. As long as we can build those building blocks that Adam talked about, and as an industry, come up with ways for the blocks to interact easier. Who knows what that is? Some people will jump to hypermedia. Maybe that's the way, defining content types. But the easier it is for us to make the composite pieces smaller, functional, and have them talk to each other, I think that's definitely the path to the future.
Yeah, I think you can already see some initiatives. The project Woven, which was an unsuccessful project on Kickstarter, but really interesting now because it's actually a device that you have at home, and you can plug in up to 50 different sensors, and it talks to all these APIs that are already social, like Facebook and Twitter, and some of them that were mentioned before. And I think that's kind of halfway there, really. But also it's interesting with privacy, because we have a real-time data and we have all the self-quantified data. I think an interesting thing is that you actually own your own data and you have it stored locally at home, and then you can choose to kind of open endpoints if you want to. but then people would be more willing to actually and eager to store this data. It's like a black box, really.
I want to make sure we get to the audience and make sure we steer this some of the ways that you're looking to go in this giant topic. Is there anyone with an Internet of Things question? Yeah, go ahead.
What happens with the question of integrity and privacy and everything like that when it comes to connecting pretty much everything you have in your life with the internet and exposing that data probably to, as you were into talking before, to companies?
So yeah, so your own privacy with all this data and when it's being exposed to companies.
I think there it's a big question of security, but it's also a question of identity. The things that I am connected to, my Internet of Things, do they know that I am who I am? Which I think could be some kind of solution, actually, that you have sensors that are not connected in any way to you as a person. But also I think it's interesting with business models that you're actually willing to trade your privacy for price. And yeah, in different countries it's difficult. Like, for instance, I heard that, for instance, in Germany it's much harder with surveillance because you have a history of surveillance. But in Sweden we're so much more open to it.
So, I think you touched on two really important things. In an ideal world, this is a huge, huge opportunity for the coming of age of identity management and identity federation. What are my devices? Who am I? Who do I want to share this data with? Who do I want my devices to talk to? How can I control my data? And it's my hope that we get to a world in which that's really important and the average consumer understands that. I would, however, be surprised if the average consumer, I'm kind of two minds about this. I would be very surprised if the average consumer has the wherewithal or cares enough to manage their data on a fine-grained level. I think that when the time comes and the Internet of Things becomes ubiquitous, there's going to be so many services flying around, so many different ways to identify yourself. And I think in that case, privacy just kind of goes out the door and you hope for the best. It just seems to be the way the market has emerged. And this happened, my Facebook identity is now so many places, I can't even keep track of it. I've got 30 or 40 different logons. Which brings me to the second point, which is I'm not sure if people have a reasonable expectation of privacy, at least in America, due to just the pervasiveness of what the NSA is able to do with or without companies' permissions. And I don't know where that leads Internet of Things.
Yeah, David.
I was just thinking that often we find that companies, they're the ones that are in control of collecting the data at the moment, and I think that will be the case for a while to come. Someone who owns your device or who gave you that device will collect data to offer you a service. So if it's Volvo with a car or an energy company with an energy meter, they'll collect data and they'll give you some knowledge, and everyone will be happy with the value that that relationship has kind of made. But they won't recognize, or they won't try and make your data available to anyone else. It will always be an accident the first maybe 10 times that happens, and it will be a long time before they realize that they needed to plan for this previously. I read about the Tesla kind of API issue that just popped up recently, and it comes from this idea that well we were giving you services and we were doing that with an API, but we didn't expect anyone else to access that API. And I think that's the way it will be for a while. Tesla's probably a very smart company who thought about this. There are a lot of companies who are very stupid who won't think about this.
maybe we're getting a bit away from IoT here, but that's an interesting case you brought up. And it's interesting because it's the onus on the user, it's the onus on Tesla. It's a private API, undocumented from what I understood. Third-party applications started using it. Users start using applications knowing it's a private API. Whose fault is that? To take it back to the IoT world, maybe we would start to see things like that emerge, right? If I download software on my phone to interact with my dishwasher, but it's not using a public API, what are the implications of that? What are the terms and services involved? Do I break the warranty by using an unpublished API, right? All kinds of things we haven't even really thought about, right? It's a crazy world. Going back to, that's the Everyman view. Going back to the question about privacy, there's a lot of parts there. I think there's privacy within the store. One of the things with IoT that I think I've understood from my colleague Holger, who's the real IoT expert, we're also entering into a world where there might be subdomains of networks. So IoT devices within a network that then communicate through a central server out somewhere. If that's the model that emerges, then you might need security within the cluster of devices you have. And then that cluster speaks to the bigger cloud or network, right? Having said all that, then it starts to feel like we still have a server-to-server interaction. Maybe even the traditional API models we know still exist. It certainly feels like there's still space for the products that vendors are selling now. We just need to kind of pivot a little bit for IoT. I still see security gateways mattering. Identity is still going to matter, right? It just means supporting new constraints around low power, low bandwidth maybe, so XMPP support, securing that, things like of this nature.
And so clearly there is a lot involved here. And the great thing about a 2-day conference is that this can be the beginning of a discussion. And I know we have our internet-enabled lunch that's coming up. So join me in thanking the panel for starting this discussion. And I would recommend to anyone interested in continuing it, grab these guys in the hallways, form groups to discuss this, propose it at the unconference session, and let's keep this big topic going because it really is related to what we do.